Hello, my name is Benton Reed, and welcome to another Speed Draw. Today we're going to be doing a piece inspired by one of the boss fights with the broken vessel from the video game Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight is one of my favorite games. It is so gorgeously animated and also really fun to play, but mainly just gorgeously drawn, gorgeously animated, and I really wanted to kind of do a study of it and take some inspiration from it and try to make something in my style based on the assets from the game. So we're just going to be doing kind of a mix between pixel art and animation. Going through the sprite sheets for this to kind of find the references and go off the references was such an educational experience, and I'm really excited to show what I managed to get out. So, without further ado, let's begin. So, the very first thing I did is I kind of blocked in a couple of frames, but the nice thing about Hollow Knight is that it's very clearly divided into layers to give you that parallax platformer kind of feel. So I started in by laying out the bottom side of these straight black items and then just laying in the floor texture, which kind of has this I almost likened it to a spinal column, the way that it looked and the way that it kind of felt to draw. It felt very similar to drawing a spinal column to me, which may just mean that I draw spines too much, but going in, adding a lot of texture, and just trying to bring out some of the shape and the form that's present in the hand-painted using the minimal colors and the minimal blending that's available to me doing pixel art. Just taking that all the way across the floor and really trying to just match the reference that I was using. I did scale things a little bit different in my piece to kind of create more of an artistic composition rather than the more open composition that's present in the games, because obviously the backgrounds aren't what the game's about. It's not really what you're focusing on when you're playing the game. You're focusing on the game itself. So they kind of spread things out, scale things down, but I wanted to make things as big as possible in order to really be able to get into the details and get into the appearance of it. I also kind of wanted to stick to a semi-monochromatic kind of feel. So everything is very yellow-toned, yellow and orange and brown kind of tones, which is similar to the reference that I was going off of, but just heightened a little bit. I think I did technically go over in some of my effects and animations later the limits that would be present on a system like the Super Nintendo, but I wanted to try and stick visually to that kind of palette as much as possible. So I'm going over to this doorway entrance on the right and just starting to add in all these intricate details that are present in the painted elements of the game. And I start out by using my lightest color to kind of block out the shapes, giving it an outline because they have very solid black outlines on the art in the game, and then just slowly going back in with darker colors to add the shadow. I found that kind of flow really worked for me really well, and so I use it on a lot of details. You'll see when I get to the background arches later that have just a ton of detailed and intricate shapes that method works out really, really well for me. So after I finish that archway, I kind of start playing around with a glowing effect in the background, because there is kind of a halo glow in the actual reference photo that I was using. I didn't like how I did it there, but I'll come back to it later and find a way that I like a little better. I thought I would like the dithering on the gradient, but I just did not. And it wasn't a piece that really needed dithering or felt right with dithering. But I moved on to the big yellow plague buboes off to the side. These are one of my favorite elements in Hollow Knight. They're so squishy and fun to pop, and they make such satisfying particle effects and sounds when you squish on them. And they're also just really fun and simple to draw, so I draw a bunch of those, and then I start laying in all of the bug bodies in the background. So in this particular area of the game, there's a lot of kind of roly-poly carcasses in the background that have these really nice shell shapes, so I just slowly start carving those in. Kind of a similar element to the doorway details, except I start with my darkest color and then work towards light, blocking in the general shapes and then creating specific form using my highlights. And I get a nice sense of those. I'll end up kind of dulling them back down a little bit to try and help them to blend into the background. I don't want them pulling too much focus from the main bulk of the piece, but I still want them to be visible and have their details visible, even though they're a little less intricate and detailed just by nature of the medium than the original reference. Add a huge pile over there. Again, just slowly adding all of the highlights and details to make them look nice and rounded, so you get that sense of a round form. They do kind of start to look like croissants, which I both love and hate, because I just like bread. Adding to my jet black foreground elements, I start adding in some of the vines and grass kind of elements that are present, and just really drawing in these nice prickly grass shapes. And then a couple more buboes pushed back in farther into the background, trying to use some screen layers to kind of push the things back to create like a foggy effect. I don't really like how it works here, but I end up kind of modifying it a little bit in a way that I think works pretty well. I think the way that I was doing it originally made the background elements too light and kind of messed with the depth of the piece. You can see here that background right there was jet black. And with the screen layer, it just didn't look how I wanted. I started trying to lay in the big background, just wasn't feeling it, wasn't liking what I was doing. So I left for a couple of days from this point. And when I came back, I decided to start with the archways instead of the true background, just to give myself something a little more detailed to focus on that wasn't so general. And when I say detailed, I mean detailed. These arches are very detailed, and I'm so incredibly happy with how they turned out. They're one of my favorite parts of the piece. And you can see I'm cheating a little bit because I think that you should make things easier for yourself as an artist. I draw a line straight down the middle and I lay in my pattern on one side because the archways in the actual thing are pretty much symmetrical. They may not have been exactly mirrored symmetrically, but the pattern and design on them is pretty symmetrical. So for a background element like this, I decided it was perfectly fine to just draw it in, block it in, do all my shading the same way that I did the other details, starting with the lighting color, the lighter color, and then adding in outline and shadows, and just drawing it all in, getting it nice and even, and then I'm just gonna flip it over the axis and then copy and paste it along the way to create this line of archways, this kind of colonnade of sorts. And they're so pointy, they have so many fun details. It came out looking very Castlevania, I think, which I appreciate because I love the art design in the Castlevania games and the 2D Castlevanias. And I had a little gradient at the top to kind of blur the top of it, and I also used the blur tool in Sprite to kind of push them back, get them a little blurry, because there is kind of a blur effect in the reference photos. And then I go back to my background, and I still kind of struggle with it at first. I get some shapes that I really like, but they just look way too flat in the two-tone color that I tried the first time. So instead, I eventually will go back through and just add shading to it, and I think it helps so much. I thought that far of a background element, it would be better to keep it as simple as possible, but it really just didn't look good. So you can see me come back through and add some shading elements that I think really help the piece kind of stick out. And really also blend together a little bit this very background element to the rest of the things. Now, it's time for the character drawing, which was a long process. I think just the character animation probably took me the better part of 3 hours to do. Total draw time was probably somewhere around, I think, 7 hours, and this was probably the better part of 3 hours to do. So a good chunk of it. But I was looking up the sprite sheets from the game and trying my best to kind of reference them and draw from them. It involved a lot of subtle head movements of this very strangely shaped head shape. And let me tell you, it's really hard to rotate things in such small increments in pixel art, at least for a relatively inexperienced pixel artist like myself. So it was definitely a challenge, but a good challenge that I think I learned quite a good bit from. And seeing how they pace things, seeing how they time the animations. I looked up a reference video of this animation sequence that I was referencing to kind of take from and take some of the timing elements from and see how they did it. And a lot of it at the beginning is just drawing this plague boil kind of almost breathing itself to life from the broken vessel's head, from inside his little mask. And I apologize, this section's going to get a little bit flashy as I'm going back and forth between frames very, very quickly. So another little head tilt, he goes kind of all the way forward and all the way down in this like headbang position. And so much of it was getting the head shape right was getting the tilt of the eyes correct and getting the movement of the boil to the right shape so that it really kind of felt like it was moving back and forth with some degree of weight, and using a little bit of stretch on some of the scenes, some of the frames to kind of create, again, just that sense of movement, especially because I don't really have motion blur working in such a pixelated format. It's hard to get motion blur sometimes. So this was a really good way to kind of stretch things out and get some energy into the animation. And I think it honestly worked very well. I'll come back through after I draw all the frames in and use just a very light blur to kind of help soften the edges of him just a little bit, because he does kind of feel very pointy and chunky compared to the background elements. But I'm just going through frame by frame, going in pure straight ahead to draw in all these movements, all the movements of the cloak, all the movements of the head, all the movements of the boil, just to get the base frames that I need. There's a couple that will be duplicated later on, but it's really just a long and boring process of just drawing the same shapes in slightly different configurations over and over and over again. But that's straight ahead animation for you. It's just subtle variations. And they are very subtle. But I really like the color palette that I found for him. It worked very naturally with kind of the default color palette in Sprite, which was nice. I didn't have to do too much color hunting. I was able to kind of use mostly the same colors that I already had available. Didn't have to go too far outside my palette from everything else. And I mean, there's just a lot of like really intentional design that you can see in the way that these characters are drawn in the base game. Of like, there's very few pure white elements other than the masks of the bugs, and so it makes them really, really stand out. And you see me doing some duplications, so I'm mimicking his roar cycle when he kind of wakes up for the first time. So I duplicate the scream frames from his roar. I go through with my blur tool, like I said, to kind of blur him out and soften him up. And then I wanted to copy the particle effect that happens when he roars, which is kind of this expanding ring that goes out from his body as he roars, that most of the enemies do when they roar, the boss enemies at least. And it's just scribbling these lines in over and over, and then going back with my jumble and my blur tool to soften it out and make it look a little bit more like the kind of foggy particle effect that's present in the game. And you can kind of see the animation going really, really quickly. But in just a second, after he's done freaking out, there we go. That's my Hollow Knight animation. You can see him really just digging up. And I'm really, really happy with how it turned out. It was a really educational experience to get in and dig around in all these sprite sheets and frames and see how the developers of Hollow Knight used that in the game to kind of balance things in the way that it makes it look so incredible, and the movement is also incredible. It was very fun to reference and very fun to play around with. So that is my little Hollow Knight drawing. I'm hoping to finish the game fully sometime soon. I've been playing it off and on. I've got to the worst ending, and now I've just got to go through and collect and beat everything to get to the best ending, which may be a while off. But I hope you enjoyed this little animation, this little speed draw, and I'll see you next time.